In this section, we're going to discuss how identity is managed in Azure with regards to applications. To start off with, we're going to learn about what Azure AD is and how permissions are managed. Azure AD is Microsoft's cloud version of Active Directory. While there is some carryover in the concepts, Microsoft did not just do a lift and shift of Active Directory running on a Windows server. It is very much its own product. It is still an identity provider, which we will dive into shortly. It is the backend for Office 365, so even if you're not using Azure, if you have any part of the Office 365 product suite, Azure AD is the backend for that, keeping track of the users and their roles. So Teams, Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, all of these are using Azure AD. It has the built-in ability to federate with other Azure AD tenants, as well as applications that are outside of the Azure ecosystem. The use case for running ADFS or Active Directory Federation services is much smaller as they continue to expand this offering. There are different licenses available depending on what features are needed. This can include conditional access to require users to be prompted for MFA or multi-factor authentication when they're outside of the corporate office. Also has self-service password resets or helping to discover users with greater access than they should have. We won't be diving into the different licenses, but I wanted to bring them up so you're aware that they existed. Before we get started, let's talk about two things that happen when a user or application attempts to connect to a resource. The first is authentication. This is sometimes referred to as auth-in. The user or application attempting to connect to a resource will first need to validate they are who they say they are. This can be done in several ways, but the most common is a passphrase of some sort. This is where the identity provider comes into play. They either maintain the identity themselves or will federate with another identity provider to authenticate the user or application. A good analogy for this is when you're getting an apartment. They get your information, run a background check to confirm you are who they say they are, among other things, and if everything checks out, they give you a specific key for authentication. Authorization is determining if you can access a specific resource. This is also referred to as auth-z. The user or application will present their authorization token to the resource, which will then validate it with the identity provider. Once they determine if it's valid, the resource will then check to see if the user has access. If so, they will let the user application complete the request. Going back to our apartment analogy, once you have been authenticated and given a key, you can now only unlock the door to your apartment with that key. You are not authorized to access any apartment in the complex except for yours. Azure AD is an identity provider solution. This means that Azure AD is able to authenticate a request. As we just learned, this means validating a user or service is who they say they are. Additionally, if a request for a resource is in the same Azure AD tenant, it can also provide authorization for that user to see if they have access to the resources. OAuth 2.0 and OpenID Connect compliant. These are authentication and authorization standards. This gives you the ability to work with a variety of users who may be authenticating with an account provided to them by work or school, as well as with a personal account. It also gives us the ability to leverage Azure B2C, or business to consumer. This allows us to integrate with other providers like Twitter, Facebook, or Google. MSAL, or Microsoft Authentication Library, is a framework that provides token-based authentication for web apps without having to work with OAuth libraries. It can provide tokens for a user or on behalf of an application. Being able to look at more than if the username and password are correct. Azure AD is able to determine if the authentication attempt needs to have additional validation, like multi-factor authentication, or if it just needs to block the request altogether. Rather than having full access or no access, we can granularly control who can access what resources and what specific actions they can do. This is done using role-based access control, or more commonly referred to as RBAC. An advantage of this is that you have a number of authorization options created automatically. If you didn't have this, you would have to create various groups by selecting from thousands of granular permissions, which would be a nightmare at any sort of scale. Once we have created our user or application and identity provider, such as Azure AD, we can then give them authorization to access certain resources via an RBAC. We can assign permissions to a specific resource, a resource group, a subscription, or a management group. By leveraging role-based access control, we can provide users and applications with the least permissive access to resources. And equally as important is we can do it consistently, since the RBAC roles are built into Azure. For each resource type in Azure, there are typically going to be 3 roles: owner, contributor, and reader. Each role type has multiple permissions associated with it that allows it to perform various actions against that resource type. Some examples of these roles are virtual machine owner, network contributor, or monitoring reader. Each one can quickly give you an idea of what access is provided and to what resource type. Owner-contributor permissions typically give you the ability to perform write actions against the resource. The primary differentiator is that the owner gives you the ability to manage permissions on that resource, while contributor cannot. By write, we mean you're able to edit that resource. The reader role allows you to view information or make a GET request. You're not able to make changes to the resource when using the reader assignment. You can use PowerShell to see the latest roles that are available by running the command get AZ role definition. You can also search Microsoft Docs to get the latest role definitions there. Application registrations in concept is an account within Azure AD that you can assign permissions to. They are used to represent an application so it can be accessed by another resource. You may also hear them referred to as app registrations or app reg. For example, if your application needs to be able to get a secret from an Azure Key Vault, you would need to create an app registration for your application and then assign the necessary permissions in the Key Vault to allow it to access that secret. There will be one app registration for every application. If your application is deployed to multiple tenants, there will still only be one app registration. Behind the scenes, for every app registration, there's a service principal. And this is very similar to an application registration, except it is a local representation of that. So for every Azure AD tenant that your application is used in, there will be a local service principal to represent that application registration. This also means that if your app registration is deployed to a single tenant, you have an app registration and a service principal. If your application is deployed to 3 tenants, then you'll have one app registration still, but then you'll have 3 service principals, one in each tenant to represent that application. Let's take a look at the process for creating an application registration. To start with, we're going to have a user who has the necessary permissions to create an app registration. As we learned earlier, this is based on RBAC. So there are a few roles that can be assigned to give us the ability, ranging from global admin to application developer. Assuming the user has the correct permissions assigned, they can log into Azure AD and create the app registration. Once created, they then define a key or essentially a password for that app registration. The key also has an expiration date assigned to it so that this doesn't extend indefinitely. We have a way to authenticate, but it's not authorized to do anything yet. So to fix this, we assign an RBAC role to that app registration to perform the necessary tasks. For example, we may give it the VM contributor role. Now if you have an application like Octopus Deploy, we can give it the information about the app registration we just created. This would include the app registration's client ID as well as the key we created in step 2. Now with that information, it can log in as the application registration. And now if we needed to execute a pipeline that deployed a VM, for example, Octopus Deploy would be able to perform the necessary tasks based on the VM contributor role that we granted or assigned in step 3. Now that I understand more about how RBAC works and what a service principal is, let's jump into the portal and see it in action. So here we are in our Azure portal, and what we're going to do is we're going to create our application registration. So to do that, we need to start by going up to Azure Active Directory. So we can see we've got the option here, or if you type up top, Azure Active Directory, you can see we have the option. Once we're in here, we're going to create an application registration. So to do that, we go down to App Registrations, and then let's go ahead and click New. And we'll give this one a name of Sample Apple 1, and then if we look, we've got a couple different account types we can look at. In this example, we're going to basically be using it in this tenant, so we'll select that first one or leave the default of single tenant. If we wanted to work with other organizations, we have the option of doing a multi-tenant or a multi-tenant with a personal account, and that's where that Azure B2C or business to consumer connector comes into play. The other option is we can also work with personal accounts only, so it's only Azure B2C. We're going to leave this at the default. We'll go ahead and click register, and this will create the app registration for us. And if we notice, it gives us a client ID as well as an object ID, just like if we had a user account. With that said, what we're going to need to do now is we need to create a secret or a key for the app registration. So we're going to go over to certificates and secrets on the left. We're going to create a new secret, and then let's go ahead and give it a description of sample secret. And then we're going to set the expiration time or leave the expiration time for a default of 1 year. We'll go ahead and click on add, and now it's going to give us the value for this. So let's go ahead and copy this. I recommend you keep a hold of this in some safe place or some sort of secret management service, because this is a very important bit of information. You're not going to be able to retrieve it after you leave this page. So let's go ahead and paste this somewhere extremely secure, like Notepad. And now we're going to go back to our home screen, and we have created our application registration now. So we've given our application a way to authenticate, but we haven't given it access to anything yet. So to do that, let's go ahead and let's go into subscriptions. Let's go ahead and select the desired subscription. And now we're going to go to Access Control, or IAM. And we're going to click on Add Role Assignment. And let's go ahead and give it the role of virtual machine contributor. And let's go ahead now and select the application. So in this case, we've got our application called Sample Apple 1. We'll select it and we'll hit save. And now we have validated that. We can go through and check now if you'd like, then by typing sample app. And now we can see it has a virtual machine contributor permissions, or RBAC roles assigned. So what we've done now is we've created the app registration. We have defined a key for it, and then we've also assigned an RBAC role to that app registration. So now whatever application that we assign this role to, they're going to be able to have VM contributor permissions against this subscription. Going back to our PowerPoints, if we had an Octopus deploy or some other CI/CD pipeline tool, we could leverage that then to deploy virtual machines to our organization.